The radar screen showed something that shouldn't exist. Colonel Viktor Belenko stared at the glowing green dot climbing past 25,000 meters. And for the first time in his 20-year career with the Soviet Air Defense Forces, he felt a cold knot of fear settle in his stomach. This wasn't supposed to be possible. American aircraft didn't fly at that altitude. Nothing flew at that altitude. But there it was, a single bright contact, moving at impossible speed across the Kamchatka Peninsula. And it was heading straight toward the most sensitive military installations in the Soviet Far East. It was March 1982. The bunker was buried deep beneath frozen tundra, a concrete fortress lined with banks of radar equipment and plotting tables covered in acetate overlays marking Soviet air defense zones. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the ozone smell of high-powered electronics. Belenko commanded Sector 7 of the PVO Strani, the air defense forces of the motherland, responsible for protecting the eastern approaches to the USSR. His radar network stretched from Vladivostok to the Bering Strait, a web of early warning stations, tracking radars, and surface-to-air missile batteries designed to detect and destroy any American bomber or reconnaissance aircraft that dared violate Soviet airspace. The operator's voice pulled him back. "Comrade Colonel, the target is accelerating. Speed now indicates Mach 2.8, altitude 27,000 meters and still climbing." Belenko grabbed the direct line to the command bunker at Vladivostok. His hand was steady, but his mind was racing through the implications. If this was what he thought it was, if the Americans had finally deployed their legendary spy plane over Soviet territory, then everything his superiors had told him about American capabilities was a lie. But what terrified him most wasn't the aircraft itself. It was the question nobody wanted to ask. If we can see it on radar, why can't we touch it? The briefing 3 months earlier had been dismissive, almost casual. General Yuri Sokolov, the graying commander of the Far East PVO, had gathered his senior officers in a wood-paneled conference room in Moscow. The topic was the SR-71, the American reconnaissance aircraft that Western intelligence agencies claimed could fly faster and higher than any Soviet interceptor. Sokolov had lit a cigarette and smiled, the kind of smile that said he knew something everyone else didn't. "The Americans are good at propaganda," Sokolov had begun, tapping ash into a steel tray. "They tell the world they have an invincible aircraft. They parade it at air shows. They leak specifications to aviation magazines. Mach 3.2, 85,000 feet, titanium skin, a camera that can read a license plate from the edge of space." He paused, letting the smoke curl toward the ceiling. "It is all psychological warfare. They want us to believe they can fly over our motherland with impunity. They want us to waste resources chasing ghosts." Belenko had sat in the back row, listening carefully. He was a practical man, an engineer by training before he became a pilot and then a commander. He didn't deal in propaganda. He dealt in numbers, in radar cross-sections and missile envelopes. "Comrade General," Belenko had raised his hand, "if the aircraft exists, what are our intercept protocols?" Sokolov's smile had faded slightly. "The aircraft does exist, Colonel. That much is confirmed. But its capabilities are grossly exaggerated. Our MiG-25 Foxbat can reach Mach 2.8 at an altitude of 23,000 meters. The S-200 missile system has an effective ceiling of 30,000 meters. If this American spy plane violates our airspace, we have the tools to bring it down." He had stubbed out his cigarette with finality. The Americans know this. That is why they will never risk it. But standing in the radar bunker on Kamchatka, watching that impossible contact slice through the night sky, Belenko realized with sickening clarity that the general had been catastrophically wrong. The Americans had risked it, and they were getting away with it. "Scramble the alert fighters," Belenko ordered into the command circuit. "Vector them to intercept heading 090. Inform them the target is high altitude, high speed. American reconnaissance aircraft, probable SR-71. The response came back within seconds. 2 MiG-25s launching from Yelizovo Air Base. Estimated time to intercept, 12 minutes. 12 minutes. Belenko did the math in his head. At Mach 28, the American aircraft would cross 300 nautical miles in that time. It would penetrate deep into Soviet airspace, photograph whatever it wanted, and be long gone before his interceptors even reached firing position. Unless the missiles could do what the fighters couldn't. "Activate S-200 batteries at sites Delta 7 and Delta 9, Belenko commanded. "Prepare to engage on my order." The tactical display updated. 2 missile sites, their radar dishes swiveling toward the contact, their launchers elevated and ready. The S-200 Angara was the pride of Soviet surface-to-air missile design. A long-range killer designed specifically to destroy American B-52 bombers before they could release their nuclear payloads. Its missiles were massive, weighing over 7,000 kilograms, propelled by liquid fuel rocket engines that could push them to Mach 6. The warhead carried 200 kilograms of high explosives wrapped around thousands of steel fragments. A direct hit would vaporize any aircraft ever built. But as Belenko watched the tracking data stream in, he felt that knot of fear tighten. The American aircraft was now at 29,000 meters, 95,000 feet. It was climbing through the ceiling of the S-200's engagement envelope like it wasn't even there. The missile could theoretically reach that altitude, but only at the very edge of its fuel reserves, where the air was so thin that the control surfaces barely functioned. And the target wasn't just high. It was fast. Faster than anything Belenko had ever seen on a radar screen. "Sir, the MiG-25s are reporting visual contact negative," the tactical officer reported. "They are at their service ceiling, 22,000 meters, but the target is above them. They are requesting permission to engage with missiles." "Denied," Belenko snapped. The R-40 air-to-air missiles carried by the MiG-25 were designed for head-on attacks against bombers, not vertical shots against targets in the stratosphere. Firing them would be a waste. "Order them to maintain pursuit. I want constant updates on that target's position." He turned to the missile battery commanders on the open circuit. "Delta 7, Delta 9, you are authorized to engage. Fire at will." The room fell silent, except for the hum of the electronics and the distant rumble of compressors. Every man in that bunker knew what they were witnessing. This was the moment. The test of Soviet air defense doctrine against America's most advanced technology. If they brought this aircraft down, it would be a propaganda victory of staggering proportions. The wreckage of the legendary SR-71, the unstoppable spy plane, scattered across the Siberian tundra for the world to see. It would prove that Soviet engineering, Soviet systems, Soviet strategy were superior. If they failed. Delta 7, missiles away. 2 rounds launched. The controller's voice was calm, professional. On the tactical display, 2 new contacts appeared, bright red trajectories arcing upward from the missile site, accelerating toward the American aircraft. The S-200 missiles climbed at terrifying speed, their exhaust plumes visible on the optical tracking cameras as pillars of white fire against the night sky. Belenko watched the intercept geometry develop on the screen. The missiles were closing, their active radar seekers locked onto the target. 20 kilometers, 15, 10. The American aircraft showed no sign of evasive action. It maintained its course, its speed, its altitude, as if the missiles didn't exist. 5 kilometers. 3. And then, with a precision that seemed almost contemptuous, the American pilot did something that shouldn't have been possible. The radar contact accelerated. Not slowly, not gradually, but instantaneously, as if someone had thrown a switch. The speed indicator jumped from Mach 2.8 to Mach 3.0, then Mach 3.2. The SR-71 simply walked away from the missiles, outrunning them as if they were standing still. The S-200 rockets, their fuel exhausted, their warheads unfired, tumbled back toward Earth in long ballistic arcs. The American aircraft continued on its programmed course, photographing Soviet installations, and there was absolutely nothing Belenko could do about it. Delta 9, fire. His voice was tight, controlled, but inside he felt something breaking. This wasn't just a failure of technology. This was a failure of doctrine, of philosophy, of everything he had been taught about the balance of power between the United States and the Soviet Union. The second pair of missiles launched. They tracked. They closed. And once again, the American aircraft simply accelerated out of reach, climbing to 31,000 meters, then 32, vanishing into the thin black void at the edge of space where Soviet missiles couldn't follow and Soviet fighters couldn't breathe. The MiG-25 pilots, their engines overheating from prolonged maximum power flight, were forced to break off pursuit. They landed back at Yelizovo with nothing to show for their effort but burnt turbine blades and damaged pride. The American spy plane exited Soviet airspace 18 minutes after it had entered, crossing back into international airspace over the Sea of Okhotsk. It had penetrated 400 kilometers into the USSR, photographed strategic bomber bases, naval facilities, and ballistic missile fields, and not a single Soviet weapon had come within 5 kilometers of touching it. The radar contact faded from Belenko's screen, and the bunker fell into a stunned, humiliated silence. Belenko sat down heavily in his chair. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline draining away and leaving only exhaustion and a growing sense of dread. He had just watched America's air superiority demonstrated in the most brutal, undeniable way possible. The SR-71 wasn't a propaganda myth. It was real, and it was untouchable. But what terrified him, what kept him awake in the hours that followed as he wrote his after-action report, was the certainty that this would not be the last time. The Americans had proven they could violate Soviet airspace at will. They had proven that the most sophisticated air defense network in the world, the shield that protected the motherland, was powerless against this aircraft. And they would come back, again and again and again, because they knew what Colonel Viktor Belenko now knew with cold, absolute certainty. The Soviet Union had no answer for the Blackbird. None at all. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to be absolutely outmatched, to watch your enemy operate with complete impunity while you can do nothing but watch, you're beginning to understand the nightmare that was about to unfold for Soviet air defense forces across the entire USSR. This wasn't the end of the humiliation. This was just the beginning. The report landed on Belenko's desk 3 days later, stamped with the red seal of the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence. It was thick, nearly 40 pages of technical analysis and tactical recommendations, and it made Viktor Belenko want to put his fist through a wall. The cover page bore a single title in bold Cyrillic letters: Assessment of American SR-71 Reconnaissance Capabilities and Recommended Countermeasures. He had requested this analysis immediately after the March incident, hoping for answers, for solutions, for anything that would give him the tools to stop the next intrusion. What he got instead was a masterclass in bureaucratic delusion. The GRU analysts, working from fragmentary intelligence and reverse-engineered American technical documents, had built a detailed profile of the SR-71 Blackbird. The aircraft was indeed real. It was powered by two Pratt & Whitney J58 turbo ramjet engines, each capable of producing 34,000 pounds of thrust. At Mach 3 peaks, roughly 3,500 kilometers per hour, the skin temperature of the aircraft reached over 600 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause conventional aluminum airframes to soften and fail. The Americans had solved this problem by building the entire aircraft out of titanium, a metal so difficult to machine that it had required the development of entirely new manufacturing techniques. The SR-71's fuel was a specialized blend called JP7, so stable that you could drop a lit match into a bucket of it and the match would go out. The aircraft didn't just fly fast. It was a systems integration marvel, a fusion of materials science, aerodynamics, and propulsion technology that represented the absolute cutting edge of American aerospace engineering. All of this Belenko already knew or had guessed. What he wanted to know was how to kill it. The GRU's answer, buried on page 37 under a section titled Tactical Engagement Protocols, was both straightforward and utterly useless. The report recommended improved coordination between ground-based radar networks and interceptor aircraft, enhanced early warning procedures to maximize engagement time, and the deployment of additional S-200 and S-300 missile batteries along likely SR-71 flight corridors. It was a plan designed by men who had never stood in a radar bunker and watched a Mach 3 target simply disappear over the horizon while your missiles fell uselessly back to Earth. Belenko threw the report across his office. It hit the concrete wall and fell open to a page covered in intercept geometry diagrams, neat little arrows and circles that bore no resemblance to the chaos of actual combat. The problem wasn't coordination. The problem wasn't early warning. The problem was physics. The SR-71 operated in a flight regime where Soviet weapons simply could not follow. It was that simple and that terrifying. The Americans had built an aircraft that existed outside the envelope of Soviet air defense, doctrine, and no amount of improved procedures or additional missile batteries was going to change that fundamental reality. But Moscow didn't want to hear about fundamental realities. Moscow wanted results. And so, when the SR-71 returned 6 weeks later, Belenko was ordered to try again. The pattern was always the same. The aircraft would appear on long-range radar as it approached from international airspace, usually over the Pacific or the Bering Sea. It would accelerate to cruise speed, climb to operational altitude, and cross into Soviet territory with the casual inevitability of the sunrise. Belenko would scramble his fighters, he would activate his missile batteries, and he would watch, helpless, as the American spy plane photographed whatever it wanted and then vanished back into the stratosphere before a single Soviet weapon could reach it. The second intrusion was over Vladivostok, the headquarters of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. The SR-71 overflew the naval base in broad daylight, its contrail a long white scar across the blue sky, visible to thousands of Soviet sailors and civilians who stood staring upward in disbelief. Belenko launched 4 MiG-25 interceptors this time, coordinating their approach vectors to maximize the chance of at least one pilot getting a shot. The MiG-25s climbed to their absolute ceiling, their engines screaming in protest, their airframes shuddering from the stress. At 23,000 meters, the pilots could see the American aircraft above them, a dark cruciform shape trailing twin contrails that glowed orange in the late afternoon sun. They fired their R-40 missiles in desperation, knowing the shots were hopeless, watching the rockets arc upward and then tumble away as their rocket motors burned out 3,000 meters below the target. The SR-71 continued on its course, untouched, untroubled, unstoppable. The third intrusion was over the Kamchatka submarine bases, where the Soviet Union's ballistic missile submarines sat in hardened pens, the ultimate deterrent against American nuclear first strike. The SR-71's cameras, equipped with optical systems that could resolve objects less than a foot across from 85,000 feet, photographed every submarine, every support vessel, every command bunker. The Americans now had a complete picture of Soviet Pacific Fleet dispositions, and there was nothing Belenko could do to prevent them from updating that picture whenever they chose. By the fifth intrusion, Belenko had stopped feeling anger. Anger required hope, the belief that things could be different, that effort and determination could change the outcome. What he felt now was something colder, more corrosive. It was the slow poison of humiliation, the knowledge that he commanded the most sophisticated air defense network outside of Moscow itself, and it was completely, utterly impotent against this single American aircraft. His men felt it too. The radar operators who tracked the SR-71's approach, the missile battery crews who fired uselessly into empty sky, the MiG-25 pilots who returned from intercept missions with nothing but fuel exhaustion and damaged engines. They were professionals, trained to defend the motherland, and they were being made to look like children throwing rocks at a jet aircraft. The psychological toll was worse than any direct military defeat. Soviet air defense doctrine was built on the principle of integrated coverage. The idea that overlapping radar zones and missile batteries created an impenetrable shield through which no enemy aircraft could penetrate. The PVO Strany was the pride of the Soviet military, the wall that protected the homeland from American bombers. And the SR-71 was walking through that wall like it was made of paper. Every successful intrusion was proof that the wall was an illusion. Every failed intercept was a demonstration that Soviet technology, Soviet training, Soviet doctrine was inferior to America's single reconnaissance aircraft. Major Dmitry Volkov, one of Belenko's most experienced MiG-25 pilots, stopped by the colonel's office after a particularly frustrating intercept attempt. Volkov was 32, a veteran of hundreds of intercept missions against American P-3 patrol aircraft and occasional probing flights by U.S. Air Force bombers. He was good at his job, one of the best pilots in the Far East PVO. But the SR-71 had broken something in him. "We can't catch it, sir," Volkov said, his voice flat, emotionless. He was still wearing his pressure suit, his helmet tucked under one arm. "I pushed my aircraft to the absolute limit today. My engine temperature was in the red. My fuel was down to emergency reserves. I got within 8 kilometers, close enough to see it with my own eyes. And it was just there, flying straight and level. No evasive maneuvers, no countermeasures. It didn't need to evade because it knew we couldn't touch it. The Americans are laughing at us, Colonel, and they have every right to." Belenko had no answer. What could he say? That Moscow was working on a solution? That new weapons were being developed? The truth was that the entire Soviet military-industrial complex, the same system that had built tens of thousands of tanks and fighter aircraft, was fundamentally incapable of producing an answer to the SR-71. The aircraft existed in a technological realm that Soviet engineering could observe but not replicate. The Americans hadn't just built a faster plane. They had built a system that required advances in metallurgy, engine design, fuel chemistry, and aerodynamics that the Soviet Union, for all its scientific talent, could not match. And then came the truly disturbing intelligence. In August 1982, A GRU source inside the United States Air Force confirmed what Belenko had begun to suspect. The SR-71 intrusions weren't reconnaissance missions in the traditional sense. They were tests. The Americans were deliberately probing Soviet air defenses, not just to photograph military installations, but to measure the response. Every scrambled fighter, every fired missile, every activated radar provided data. The Americans were building a comprehensive picture of Soviet air defense capabilities, reaction times, intercept procedures, and weapon performance. They were mapping the wall, identifying every weakness, every gap, every limitation. And they were doing it with complete impunity. The implications were staggering. If the Americans could penetrate Soviet airspace at will with a reconnaissance aircraft, what else could they do? The SR-71 flew alone, unarmed, relying entirely on speed and altitude for survival. But what if the Americans developed bombers with similar capabilities? What if they created fighters that could operate in that same high-speed, high-altitude regime? The entire foundation of Soviet air defense strategy, the massive investment in radar networks and surface-to-air missiles, would become obsolete overnight. The Americans would own the sky above 25,000 meters, and there was nothing the Soviet Union could do to contest it. Belenko started having nightmares. In them, he stood in his radar bunker watching dozens, then hundreds of American aircraft appear on his screens, all flying at Mach 3, all untouchable. He would give orders that nobody could execute. He would fire weapons that couldn't reach their targets. He would watch the Soviet Union's defenses collapse while he stood helpless. He would wake up in his small quarters at the base, drenched in sweat, and realize that the nightmare was just a preview of what would happen if the Cold War ever turned hot. The final humiliation came in November, during a visit by General Sokolov, the same officer who had assured Belenko 6 months earlier that the SR-71 was mostly propaganda. Sokolov arrived during an active intrusion, the 8th that year, and Belenko was forced to brief the general on the tactical situation while the American aircraft cruised through Soviet airspace on the overhead display. The general's face was gray, his earlier confidence completely gone. He watched in silence as the SR-71 completed its mission and departed. And then he turned to Belenko with a question that had no good answer. If war comes tomorrow, Colonel, and the Americans send bombers with these capabilities, how long can we hold? Belenko met the general's eyes. This was the moment for truth, for the kind of brutal honesty that could end a career but might save lives. We can't hold, sir. Not against aircraft with this performance. Our entire air defense network is optimized for subsonic bombers and cruise missiles. We assumed speed was limited by heat, that materials would fail, that engines would melt. The Americans solved those problems. They built an aircraft that operates outside our engagement envelope, and we have no counter. If they build bombers with similar capabilities, if they develop fighters that can escort those bombers, we lose. It's that simple. The general nodded slowly, and Belenko saw in his expression something he had never expected to see from a Soviet officer of that rank. It was fear. Not the fear of death in combat, but something deeper, more existential. It was the fear that came from realizing that everything you believed about your nation's power, your military's capabilities, your system's superiority, was built on foundations that were crumbling beneath your feet. The Americans weren't just ahead. They were playing a different game, operating in a different dimension, and the Soviet Union didn't have the technology, the resources, or the system to catch up. Write a full report, Sokolov said finally. Everything you've observed, every failed intercept, every limitation, every weakness. I want it on my desk within a week. The pilot bureau needs to understand what we're facing. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. They won't believe it, you know. They'll say you're exaggerating. They'll say you're making excuses. But document it anyway. Because one day, Colonel, this will matter. One day someone will need to understand why we failed. Belenko wrote the report. 43 pages of technical analysis, intercept data, and tactical assessments. He documented every SR-71 intrusion, every failed engagement, every limitation of Soviet air defense systems. He included testimony from his pilots, data from his radar operators, performance specifications from his missile crews. He laid out, in precise, unemotional detail, the complete and total superiority of American reconnaissance capabilities over Soviet air defenses. He concluded with a recommendation that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. The Soviet Union needed to fundamentally rethink its approach to air defense, because the current system was obsolete. It was designed to fight the last war, not the next one. And if the Americans ever chose to exploit the gap that the SR-71 had revealed, the consequences would be catastrophic. The report disappeared into the bureaucracy of the Soviet defense establishment. Belenko never received a response. The SR-71 intrusions continued, sporadic but regular, each one a reminder that America could see into the heart of the Soviet Union whenever it chose, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Belenko began to wonder about the larger implications. If the Americans were this far ahead in reconnaissance, what else had they developed in secret? What other technological surprises were waiting to be revealed? The thought kept him awake at night more than any nightmare ever could. Because if you were watching your enemy operate with this kind of technological superiority, this kind of casual dominance, you had to ask yourself the question that nobody in Moscow wanted to answer. What happens when they decide to stop just looking? 9 years later, Viktor Belenko was no longer a colonel commanding a radar sector. He was a general, overseeing air defense training at the Zhukovsky Air Force Academy outside Moscow, teaching the next generation of Soviet officers about the realities of modern aerial warfare. He was older now, grayer, his hands marked with the tremor that came from too many years of cigarettes and stress. But on the night of January 17th, 1991, sitting in his small apartment watching grainy CNN footage on a smuggled television set, Viktor Belenko felt like he was back in that concrete bunker on Kamchatka, staring at a radar screen showing something impossible. Baghdad was burning. Not from carpet bombing, not from the kind of massive aerial assault that Soviet doctrine anticipated, but from surgical strikes so precise they seemed almost supernatural. The American-led coalition had launched Operation Desert Storm, and in the first hours of the war, they had systematically destroyed the Iraqi air defense network, the very same Soviet-designed system that Belenko had spent his career defending. The Iraqis had SA-2, SA-3, and SA-6 missiles. They had integrated radar coverage. They had French command and control systems coordinating their response. On paper, Baghdad's defenses were nearly as sophisticated as Moscow's own, and they were being torn apart by an enemy they couldn't even see. The CNN reporter was talking about stealth aircraft, about the F-117 Nighthawk, an American bomber that was invisible to radar. Belenko leaned forward, his vodka forgotten on the table beside him. The footage showed night vision images of precision-guided bombs falling through the green-tinted darkness, hitting specific buildings, destroying command centers and communications nodes with terrifying accuracy. The Iraqis were firing thousands of anti-aircraft guns into empty sky, their tracers arcing upward in desperate, random patterns. They were shooting at ghosts because their radars showed nothing. It was the SR-71 nightmare made real. multiplied by an entire fleet of invisible aircraft. And Belenko understood with absolute clarity that the question he had asked 9 years earlier had just been answered. The Americans had decided to stop just looking. The television showed an interview with an American Air Force general, his face confident, almost casual. "The F-117 has performed flawlessly," the general said. "We've achieved complete air superiority in the opening hours of the conflict. Iraqi air defenses are essentially neutralized." Belenko recognized that tone, that absolute certainty. It was the same confidence General Sokolov had displayed in 1982 when he dismissed the SR-71 as propaganda. Except this time, the confidence was justified. The Americans had built not just one revolutionary aircraft, but an entire family of them. Stealth bombers, stealth fighters, aircraft that could penetrate the most sophisticated air defense networks in the world and strike with impunity. The YALF reports coming out of Iraq in the following weeks confirmed Belenko's worst fears. The Iraqi Air Force, equipped with Soviet MiG-25s, MiG-29s, and French Mirage fighters, had been swept from the sky. The American F-15 Eagles and F-16 Fighting Falcons had achieved kill ratios that seemed impossible, shooting down dozens of Iraqi aircraft without losing a single fighter to air-to-air combat. But it was the technology behind those victories that terrified Belenko. The Americans had beyond visual range missiles guided by radar systems so advanced they could track multiple targets simultaneously. They had AWACS aircraft providing God's eye view of the entire battlefield. They had electronic warfare systems that jammed Iraqi radars while simultaneously mapping their exact locations for follow-up strikes. The Soviet Union had spent 40 years preparing to fight the last war, building masses of tanks and fighters designed for a grinding conventional conflict in Central Europe. The Americans had skipped ahead to the next war, the one where information dominance and technological superiority mattered more than numbers. The SR-71 hadn't been an anomaly. It had been a warning, a preview of the revolution that was coming. And the Soviet Union, with its centralized command economy, its emphasis on quantity over quality, its fundamental inability to innovate at the speed required by modern warfare, had missed it completely. Belenko thought about his report from 1982, the 43 pages of warnings and recommendations that had disappeared into Moscow's bureaucracy. He wondered if anyone had read it, if anyone had understood the implications. The Americans could see into the heart of the Soviet Union whenever they chose, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. He had documented it. He had warned them. And they had ignored him because accepting the truth would have required admitting that the entire Soviet air defense doctrine, the billions of rubles spent on radar networks and missile batteries, was obsolete. By February, the ground war in Iraq was over. The American M1 Abrams tanks, the same vehicles Soviet analysts had dismissed as overweight boondoggles in the 1980s, had destroyed thousands of Iraqi T-72 tanks, the export versions of the very same tanks that formed the backbone of Soviet armored forces. American infantry, equipped with night vision and GPS navigation, had maneuvered through the desert with a precision that Soviet doctrine said was impossible. American logistics, the supply chain that Soviet planners had assumed would be the weak point, had sustained 500,000 troops in a foreign desert with an efficiency that seemed superhuman. The final casualty count was devastating in its asymmetry. Coalition forces had lost fewer than 300 troops. Iraqi losses were estimated at 25,000 to 35,000. The technological gap wasn't just a gap. It was a chasm. And the Soviet Union, despite decades of competition, despite matching the Americans weapon for weapon in numbers, had fallen so far behind that catching up was no longer possible. The Cold War was over, and it had ended not with a nuclear exchange, but with a demonstration that one side's technology had simply evolved beyond the other's ability to compete. Belenko turned off the television and sat in the darkness of his Moscow apartment. Outside, the Soviet Union was collapsing. The economy was in ruins. The republics were declaring independence. The Communist Party was losing its grip on power. But what haunted Belenko wasn't the political disintegration. It was the knowledge that the military collapse had happened years earlier, that the moment the SR-71 had first appeared on his radar screen in 1982, the war was already lost. The Americans had shown their hand, demonstrated their dominance, and the Soviet Union had been powerless to respond. He thought about Major Volkov, the MiG-25 pilot who had gotten within 8 kilometers of the SR-71 and watched it simply fly away. He wondered where Volkov was now, if he was still flying, if he had watched the same CNN footage and felt the same sick realization. They had dedicated their lives to defending the motherland. And it turned out the motherland's defenses were built on obsolete doctrine and wishful thinking. The Americans had been ahead, not just in one aircraft, but in an entire generation of military technology. Stealth, precision weapons, night vision, GPS navigation, networked command and control. They hadn't just built better weapons. They had reimagined what war could be. The final lesson of the SR-71, the one that took 9 years and a war in the Iraqi desert to fully understand, was this: technological superiority wasn't about building a better tank or a faster aircraft. It was about building a system that could integrate sensors, weapons, communications, and logistics into a seamless whole. The Americans had built that system. The Soviet Union had built isolated platforms, impressive on paper, but incapable of working together effectively. And when the two systems finally met in combat, the result wasn't a battle. It was an execution. Belenko poured himself another vodka and raised the glass in a silent toast to the American pilots, the engineers, the planners who had built the SR-71 and everything that came after it. They had won the Cold War, not through diplomacy or economics, but through innovation. They had built weapons that rendered Soviet defenses irrelevant. And they had done it so thoroughly that by the time the Soviet Union realized what was happening, it was already too late to catch up. The laughter in that Moscow briefing room in 1978, the jokes about the M1 Abrams being too heavy and too complex, had been the sound of an empire in denial. And the silence in Belenko's apartment in 1991 was the sound of an empire finally understanding the price of that denial. The Americans had shown them the future. And in that future, the Soviet Union had no place at all.